immediately claims central space, opening diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting an ambitious tone for the game. Opening the center's tension. This symmetrical pawn push immediately declares an intent for a classical, tactical struggle. Developing the knight opens lines for your queen and prepares to castle, immediately contesting the center. Developing the knight to c6 directly contests white's pawn and prepares to defend the king's pawn. A solid classical response. Unleashing the Ruy Lopez. This probing bishop immediately questions black's knight, creating a strategic battleground on the queenside and hinting at future pawn structure dynamics. Challenging white's bishop immediately gains space, potentially forcing a decision about its placement. Preserving the bishop's diagonal presence maintains central pressure, subtly limiting black's knight development and future pawn advances. Developing the knight here actively challenges white's central pawn and aims to disrupt their bishop pair's harmony, securing the king against immediate threats. This castling prepares for central action and potential pawn advances. Developing the bishop actively here prepares for a bold queenside expansion while eyeing the f2 square. Bolstering the pawn chain and preparing d4 is the idea, preventing immediate central skirmishes and aiming for a comfortable queenside pawn majority buildup, while subtly discouraging black's bishop from retreating to b4. Expanding boldly on the queenside, black seizes central space and aims to dislodge the bishop, though this creates a pawn weakness on c6 which white might exploit later. Retreating the bishop back to safety secures this valuable piece from further immediate threats and maintains pressure along the kingside diagonal, while subtly preparing for potential pawn advancements or piece repositioning later in the middle game. Solidifying the pawn chain, black now prepares to challenge white's center and potentially gain space on the queenside, while simultaneously creating a haven for their king. Striking the center with vigor, white immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens lines for the pieces, aiming to unbalance the position and create attacking chances. Instead of reinforcing the central pawn structure, black opts for a more flexible approach by withdrawing the bishop. This maintains the bishop's influence on the long diagonal and keeps options open for developing the kingside. The move subtly challenges white's central pawns, preparing for potential pawn breaks in the future. Safeguarding the king by preemptively preventing the bishop's intrusion to g4. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount. Castling now secures the king and prepares to activate the rooks, creating a more harmonious defensive structure against white's central pressure. Bringing the rook to the e-file immediately prepares for a potential central pawn push, aiming to liberate white's position and exert pressure on black's somewhat cramped development, while also adding defensive support to the f3 knight if necessary. Solidifying the bishop's post on b7 enhances its defensive capabilities on the long diagonal, bolstering the kingside and preparing for potential future skirmishes. Developing the bishop to its most active square clears the way for the queen and prepares to contest central space, potentially eyeing a future kingside attack by anchoring a pawn advance. The central pawn exchange simplifies the position, potentially opening lines for pieces and initiating a more concrete battle rather than the slow positional buildup. Reclaiming the center with the pawn opens lines and prepares a more active placement for the queen, potentially eyeing the kingside. Asserting influence on the queenside, the knight boldly ventures to a5, eyeing the vulnerable bishop on b3 and creating potential for further expansion. This maneuver challenges white's bishop placement and aims to disrupt the harmonious development of white's pieces, potentially opening lines for counterplay on that flank. The pawn lunges forward, asserting its dominance and creating a barrier that forces the knight to reconsider its options, while simultaneously opening a diagonal for the queen and potentially threatening to blockade the opponent's central pawn structure. This exchange opens up the d-file for white's rook and immediately places pressure on black's weakened queenside pawn structure by creating an isolated pawn on d5. Opening the a-file presents an immediate dilemma for black's king position, potentially creating a long-term structural weakness. Initiating a central pawn confrontation, black aims to shatter white's consolidated pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay on the queenside. The removal of the central pawn creates an immediate imbalance, opening the d-file for potential infiltration and presenting black with a choice between maintaining pawn structure or developing piece activity. Immediately recapturing the pawn with the bishop seizes control of the central diagonal, putting immediate pressure on white's f2 square and creating a robust attacking presence. A knight repositions to a more dynamic square, eyeing potential advances and supporting a central pawn push, while simultaneously reinforcing the queenside defense against any immediate breakthroughs. Re-establishing the rook on the open e-file signals a clear intention to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially target the vulnerable e3 bishop. This is a proactive step, seeking dynamic counterplay rather than passively defending. The queen emerges from passive defense, aiming to leverage the open a-file and potentially create queenside pressure. But it also momentarily sacrifices central control and might become a target for black's centralized pieces, particularly the bishop on b7. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, seeking to pressure white's somewhat exposed kingside pawns and potentially participate in a queenside counterplay, while also avoiding the immediate threat of white's knight on d2 potentially forking it. An aggressive pawn sacrifice aims to dislodge black's well-placed bishop and seize initiative, potentially opening lines toward the black king while simultaneously activating white's queen and knight. A bold repositioning, bringing the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially challenging white's central control and eyeing weaknesses around the king. Refocusing queen activity towards the kingside opens up attacking avenues, threatening a potential queen sacrifice on f7 or g7 if black isn't vigilant. Shifting the queen to e7 cleverly reinforces the e5 pawn, a crucial defensive measure against white's bishop on d4, while simultaneously preparing to challenge the open c-file or even envisage a kingside sortie later on, clearing the path for the queen to potentially join the queenside pressure. This rook repositioning also prepares to contest the e-file should black decide to exchange pawns. A bold pawn sacrifice to disrupt the queenside structure and seize initiative. Black aims to exploit the open lines and perhaps target the now somewhat exposed white king. This energetic thrust forces white to make immediate decisions, potentially leading to sharp tactical exchanges. Repositioning the rook to the open c-file immediately contests this crucial avenue, aiming to prevent black's knights from finding a more stable foothold and potentially preparing for an eventual kingside assault or even creating threats against the pinned knight on c6 if black isn't careful. Black redirects the bishop's gaze, preparing to pressure the a-file should it open, while subtly contesting white's d4 pawn and potentially offering a strategic trade to ease the central congestion. Rerouting the knight to g3 aims to reinforce the kingside and prepare for potential pawn pushes, shifting the focus away from the queenside pressure. This pawn thrust aims to seize central space, a bold declaration of intent to disrupt white's developing harmony and open lines for black's pieces. The central pawn push often forces concessions, either creating weaknesses or dictating further exchanges that could favor black's queenside initiative. It's a strategic gamble to inject life into the position, potentially creating a strong outpost for the d-pawn or initiating a dynamic pawn storm. A surprising repositioning. This knight abandons its central influence to find a more active role on the kingside, aiming to support a potential attack or defend the monarch more robustly. Challenging white's central dominance with a pawn thrust. 23. f6 aims to shore up the kingside and potentially open a diagonal for the queen or bishop, while simultaneously creating space for a knight repositioning to g7. Initiating a repositioning to bolster the kingside. This knight seeks a more active square, perhaps preparing for an eventual g4 push to challenge black's imposing pawn chain. Establishing a solid presence on the open c-file with the rook is paramount. It directly challenges white's control and prepares for potential advances along this crucial corridor, creating a dynamic equilibrium. Initiating the advance of the rook along the open d-file now exerts significant pressure, aiming to contest black's central pawn majority and potentially create weaknesses. Suddenly, a crucial defensive resource materializes for black, bringing the queen back into the fray to shore up the d5 pawn and offer some much-needed support to the kingside. Reclaiming central influence with the knight, white aims to solidify the pawn structure and prepare for potential advances on the queenside or a more active role for the monarch. The monarch's relocation to f8 appears to be a defensive maneuver, seeking refuge from the open c-file and perhaps preparing to reinforce the kingside if necessary. Reclaiming the central e-file with the rook signals white's intent to contest this crucial pathway, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and prepare for a potential kingside advance. Reclaiming the central square and preparing to challenge white's bishop on d4 forms the core of this repositioning, aiming to disrupt the bishop pair's influence and potentially open lines for the rooks. The rook's rerouting to the third rank aims to reinforce the kingside and potentially eye the vulnerable black monarch should an opening materialize, while simultaneously unblocking the queen's diagonal for greater influence. Unpinning the queen offers a crucial outlet, finally allowing the e-pawn to advance and contest the open d-file while simultaneously preparing for a potential kingside maneuver by the dark-squared bishop. Seeking to solidify central control and prepare a potential queenside advance, the knight embarks on a circuitous route to d1, aiming to escape black's well-placed bishop on a5 and potentially support a kingside push down the f-file later. Aims to dislodge the formidable knight guarding white's central pawn. Chasing the black queen away from its active post on g6 creates a temporary respite, but it also allows white's knight to reposition itself towards a more central influence, potentially reinforcing the kingside or preparing for future skirmishes on the d-file. The knight's dance on the kingside finally culminates, allowing black to bring the queen into the fray with potent attacking intentions directed towards white's still exposed monarch. Shifting the knight back to f3 offers a flexible retreat, potentially preparing a kingside pawn storm or reinforcing the defense of the g2 square, while simultaneously aiming to redeploy to e5 or d4 to contest central squares. Shifting the rook to c7 aims to activate it on the open c-file, potentially creating pressure against white's queenside pawn structure or preparing for a central breakthrough. Solidifying the knight's position, the player aims to achieve a more harmonious piece deployment, potentially preparing a rook lift to the third rank or rerouting the knight to a more active square like g4, thereby improving its influence over the kingside. Consolidating the rook to the central file. The defender seeks to contest the crucial open column, aiming to prevent white from establishing a lasting outpost and preparing for potential future pawn thrusts or piece infiltration that could exploit the slightly exposed monarch. Unlocking the queen's diagonal and preparing to reclaim the d-file for infiltration. This maneuver aims to create persistent pressure on black's weakened queenside, forcing a reactive defense. Initiating a fascinating counterattack, black redirects the knight to a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially create threats against the king. This maneuver signals an aggressive intent, shifting from passive defense to an offensive posture. The knight's new position on g5 opens up new tactical possibilities and puts pressure on white's queenside. The board erupts as white sacrifices the knight, opening lines towards black's castled king and forcing a sharp response. This aggressive maneuver sacrifices material for a potential mating attack or at least significant positional advantage if black isn't careful. Embracing the open file, black's queen lands squarely on the kingside, eyeing the weakened g2 pawn and preparing to exploit the newfound tactical possibilities after white's recent exchange on f3. A strategic repositioning that seeks to enhance the bishop's influence and potentially eye the kingside, while also clearing the d-file for a more active rook. Black's queen, having just retreated from the dangerous outpost on g6, now eyes the center, poised to participate actively in the unfolding middle game battlefield by potentially supporting a pawn advance or even seeking new lines of attack. Launching a pawn storm on the kingside, white seeks to disrupt black's defensive setup and open lines towards the beleaguered monarch. The queen now confronts the bishop pair, a classic Lopez positional battleground, seeking to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially open lines for counterplay. Initiating a retrograde maneuver, the queen steps back, seemingly conceding the initiative, but in reality, preparing to redeploy and support a potential kingside advance. Shifting pawns on the kingside like this often signals a desire to create a new avenue of attack, perhaps aiming to undermine white's kingside pawn structure or to gain space for black's pieces to maneuver. It's a slow, deliberate build-up, trying to find a weakness in white's otherwise solid setup, but one must be careful not to overextend and create weaknesses of their own. Sealing the kingside further solidifies white's structure, although it invites potential counterplay on the central files if black can open them up. The bishop's repositioning to c8 now directly challenges the long-term pressure white's pieces have been building on the kingside, seeking to untangle black's pieces and potentially prepare for a counterattack by activating the rook on the c-file. Reclaiming the light-squared bishop's diagonal, this knight repositions to a square that could support a future kingside attack, potentially aiming for the g-file or even the f-file if circumstances allow. The queen's foray deep into white's territory, while seemingly aggressive, now faces a critical evaluation as the knight on g2 prepares to become a surprisingly active defender, aiming to box in the enemy queen and disrupt black's attacking ambitions. Reactivating the rook to the central fight, aiming to contest the d-file and potentially support a kingside advance. While the bishop pair of black remains a long-term threat, trading queens now clarifies the tactical landscape, ushering in a potentially decisive endgame phase where pawn structure and piece activity will be paramount. Simplifying the position after the queen trade, this rook now eyes the central files and offers white a clear path to potentially infiltrate black's territory. Reclaiming the open file for the rook provides a much-needed active post, promising future pressure along the 7th rank and an opportunity to disrupt white's pawn Structure. Simplifying the position by exchanging rooks. White aims to transition into an endgame where their knight might prove more active than black's. Remaining pieces. The Black King, now liberated from its castled position, ventures into the center, preparing to participate actively in the ensuing endgame, a common strategy when queens are exchanged. Reactivating the knight offers a chance to occupy the central squares, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and creating new attacking avenues. Unblocking the c-file for the rook is the immediate goal, but preparing to activate the bishop to a more central square promises a better long-term prospect for your pieces in this endgame skirmish. Targeting black's isolated pawn on d6, white aims to create a weakness that can be exploited later. Challenging the bishop's pressure on the c-file. This knight retreat aims to disrupt white's coordinated piece play, potentially preparing to redeploy for defense or counterattack. Stepping the bishop back to a5 is a clever idea, aiming to create a blockade and prevent black's rook from reaching more active squares on the second rank. This repositions the piece to a more defensive stance, anticipating black's potential incursions. Unleashing the bishop to e5 forces white to confront the advanced pawn and potentially creates a decisive outpost, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and generate counterplay on the kingside. Seizing the advanced pawn opens up attacking possibilities, but be mindful of the exposed knight and the potential for a swift counterattack on the d-file. Seizing that advanced bishop opens a tantalizing positional possibility to finally disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially launch a counterattack against their now exposed king. Unleashing the knight to b4. White reclaims the tempo lost and establishes an immediate threat against the bishop on c6. The rook's repositioning to the 8th rank now aims to contest the open file, potentially creating pawn promotion threats or offering defense against white's centralized knight. Seizing the opportunity presented by black's misplaced bishop, white snatches a pawn on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's structure and gain material superiority. Unleashing a surprise attack on the knight aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around their king, forcing the opposing king to retreat. This check aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure black has allowed, potentially creating opportunities to penetrate with the rook. The king's relocation to d7, while seemingly a step towards centralizing, dangerously exposes it to the g-file's pressure, a significant positional concession in this already complex endgame. Sacrificing tempo for a moment to consolidate pieces, aiming to exploit the now isolated b-pawn. Suddenly, a desperado's gambit appears on the board as the black rook aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create a tactical whirlwind. Seizing the open rook file with the capture is a logical step to streamline your material and simplify towards a potentially winning endgame by eliminating pieces. The exchange of pieces leaves black with a knight and pawn versus white's rook, a significant material imbalance that will heavily favor white in the ensuing endgame. The bishop redeploys to a more active square, aiming to control the crucial diagonal and potentially support a future pawn push. Shifting the monarch to d6 activates it for the endgame, seeking to support the remaining pawns and potentially contest the central squares, though it leaves the king somewhat exposed on the open file. The white king ventures forward, finally taking a more active role in the endgame, aiming to support the advanced pawns and potentially contest central squares. Seizing the open file and challenging white's entrenched bishop opens a new dynamic. The pawn structure is simplified, and black must now focus on activating their pieces and exploiting the weakened queenside. Solidifying the queenside advance opens up space for the rook and pawn majority. Asserting central dominion with the monarch allows for the king to support the advancing b-pawn, posing a direct threat to white's somewhat exposed bishop on b6 and aiming to disrupt the pawn structure. Securing the bishop's central outpost. This piece now exerts pressure across both the kingside and queenside, aiming to restrict black's bishop activity and exploit the passed pawn potential. Embracing the open lines, black boldly marches the king towards the queenside, initiating a crucial endgame skirmish for vital squares. Seeking to exploit the misplaced black bishop, white aims to secure the a-file after the inevitable exchange on c1, potentially leading to a decisive queenside initiative. Solidifying the king's position becomes paramount. This pawn advances to create a safer haven, a crucial step as the endgame unfolds and the monarch's safety is no longer guaranteed by advanced defenses. The bishop repositions, aiming to occupy the newly opened diagonal and put pressure on black's somewhat exposed king. The bishop, now returning to its original square, aims to solidify control over the d-file and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside. The knight's journey to b8 aims to disrupt black's centralized pawn structure and exploit the now weakened c6 square, potentially creating an outpost for future play or forcing concessions. The bishop retreats to c3. A surprising repositioning that opens up a fascinating tactical conundrum for white's pieces. Asserting control over the vital c-file with this knight hop immediately begins to restrict black's defensive options. Discovered tactical possibilities now bloom with the bishop's relocation, threatening to unravel white's newly established pawn structure and potentially expose their monarch. Unleashing a knight to deliver a check forces the black king to abandon its relatively safe retreat. The black king ventures out, seeking to disrupt white's entrenched pieces and perhaps find some counterplay in the open. Navigating the knight to a more active outpost at b3 aims to pressure the black pawn structure and potentially open lines for further exploitation. The king, now exposed after the queen's traded, ventures out seeking refuge on the queenside, but it might find itself a target rather than a sanctuary amidst the remaining pieces. Shifting the knight to the queenside square aims to solidify white's control over the now open queenside file and potentially create threats against black's somewhat exposed king by rerouting the knight through b3 or c4. While also considering the possibility of supporting an eventual pawn advance. Embracing the initiative in a tense endgame. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially create a passed pawn. Repositioning the bishop to attack the pawns from a new angle creates dynamic pressure. A daring but potentially perilous leap to secure the b2 pawn. Hoping to activate the bishop and perhaps force concessions. Yet it risks allowing white's knight closer to the kingside. The bishop's redeployment to c7 sets a cunning trap, aiming to exploit the overextended knight and potentially deliver a decisive blow to the opponent's weakened pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop like this gambits away a crucial defender of the king, leaving the monarch exposed to a potential mating net after the knight retreats. Reclaiming the diagonal for a potential bishop insertion offers a new dimension of pressure. Clearing the path for the bishop to reach its active outpost is the aim here, but it leaves the king exposed to potential checks from the rook. Sealing off the black king's escape routes is the priority now. And this maneuver accomplishes that by utilizing the bishop to create a formidable blockade. After a lengthy exchange, black's king now finds itself in a precarious position, caught in the crossfire of white's active pieces. The bishop on d8, while seemingly defensive, is actually a misplaced defender, unable to provide adequate support to the monarch. This entire situation hinges on white's ability to exploit the exposed king and the lack of harmonious piece play from black. The bishop repositions, seeking a more active diagonal to potentially exploit the weakness on a7 or pressure the king if it ever ventures too far. The knight's journey to c2 offers a new avenue for the black king to infiltrate, potentially exploiting the weakened b-pawn. But it also potentially exposes the king itself to further checks and counterplay if white can adequately defend. Stepping back to reposition the bishop, a subtle retreat to fortify a key outpost. The black king is finally finding some breathing room in the center, aiming to untangle from its current compromised position and seek refuge on the queenside. Initiating a repositioning maneuver to challenge black's persistently active bishop, aiming to disrupt its influence on the queenside and potentially force concessions. Reclaiming the initiative, black repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, threatening to disrupt white's queenside majority by potentially isolating the b4 pawn and creating counterplay. A bold gamble to finally activate the king, hoping to outmaneuver black's entrenched bishop and create a path for the pawn majority, despite the inherent risks of bringing the monarch into the fray. Pushing the b-pawn, aiming to create a passed threat, but does it overextend and weaken the pawn structure, potentially creating targets for white's pieces in the approaching endgame? Guiding the monarch towards the center is the only path to potentially capitalize on the opponent's pawn weaknesses. The bishop's retreat to a5 now aims to restrict white's pawn structure, a subtle but important maneuver to prepare for potential breakthroughs, opening up lines for your rook to potentially attack the vulnerable pawn structure. The bishop retreats to c7, a subtle attempt to regroup and offer support to the pawns on the queenside, though it seems to concede further space to white's active pieces and might struggle to find a truly impactful role in the face of white's central control.